Hello, my name is Jessica West. I have the developer relations and community team here at Temporal. We're super excited to have you at our June meetup, which is obviously online because we're all here on our lovely Zoom backgrounds. So with that, we have a couple things to do. We've got some announcements and some stuff that I'm going to share with y'all and go over. And then also I have our lovely Tom Wheeler's team here to give y'all a talk. And from there, we'll have some questions and we'll just get into it. Cool. Okay, so some meetup changes for those of you that are here now, and then we're here last month. You notice that we're doing some couple changes. So before we had a platform called Luma that you could register for an entire series, and we were struggling a little bit with that of like, how do we help promote individual events and point people in different things? And so we changed that a little bit. And so while it's a lot more work on the back end, there's a little bit more on the front end. So I wanted to make sure everybody understands that what that means now is that you register for individual events versus a series. So you go through and you say like, hey, I really want to hear Tom talk at this online one, or have like Lauren speaking as something else, or Fitz or whomever. So you'll go through, then you'll see that all on our community site. So if you go to temporal.io/community, you'll see that for the events. I made a lovely QR code here so you can scan that, and I'll post all these links afterwards as well, so you can check them out. A couple other things. So last month we kicked off our first Seattle meetup. So for those of you that are in person in Seattle, we're now doing a monthly meetup. And actually I'm in Seattle right now, so I'm saying here in the city, and it's pretty exciting. So what we're going to do is the last Tuesday every month will be our online one, which we welcome to everybody around the world, which we love, and bringing the community together. And then on Thursdays in Seattle, we're going to have a meetup in town around like South Lake Union area. So anybody that is in town, and if you are not doing anything this Thursday, we have a meetup that you can go in person and meet some people and chat and have some food and drink on us. But again, that's also through the community site, so you can grab there and see what you'd like to do. And then also we have a new thing that we're doing called a wandering meetup series. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide or two. But basically what we're doing is we're experimenting with having different meetups around the world, especially where we're doing a lot more work in events and everything for conferences this year. So just trying to find ways to engage with everybody that either you need a break from Zoom, or you happen to be in that city and it's pretty exciting and you want to come meet up with us or maybe some friends, and you say, hey, let's go listen to a talk at a meetup, because we weren't able to do that for 3 years. Lucky for you, we are now bringing that back into your area. So that's just a couple housekeeping things there. So Replay is our conference that we have, and it is coming up. I don't know where time went this year. It is June 27th. Replay is around the corner, September 12th through 14th, and it is in Seattle, Washington. Our tickets are on sale right now, so there's an early bird until July 16th. So if you would like to join us, we'd love to see you. Again, you can grab this QR code and grab some tickets if you'd like to. We had our CFP open for a little bit, and then we closed that June 1st. We have let our first round of speakers know that there are some acceptances, and so we've had some wait lists, and then unfortunately we had to decline some, which was hard because let me tell you, going through all those speakers, there's a lot of great content. We really appreciate all the effort that it takes just to even apply to a CFP and put that effort there. So thank you everybody that did apply, and thank you to those that are coming in and joining us. And for those waitlisted, I have an email scheduled to set out to you today. So we really encourage that we want to make sure that we're engaging with y'all as much as we can in all these community aspects. And really this year, and really every year, what we're doing is trying to double down and keep adding more and more things to engage the community in different ways. So thank you again for those that applied to CFP. And for those that are like, I'm not interested in talking, but I want to come see Replay, you should do that. So that's my other one. Okay, so upcoming, I mentioned about the Wandering Meetup series. So we've been busy in June. We've already hit up a couple places around Europe. We have 2 more left. Some are happening right now. So we've got GopherCon happening in Europe and Berlin. So if you are in Berlin, go see if you see like a bunch of like people kind of coming in with like gophers on the shirt, they're probably there for GopherCon. So that's happening right there. We've got some staff there giving some talks. Again, I mentioned we've got our Seattle meetup here in Seattle at the Disney office on Thursday. In July, we're around Europe as well for kind of EuroPython, some Golang meetups, and some conferences around there. So this is a little bit heavy in Europe these 2 months, and then we'll swing back over towards the States later on. But if this is something that you are interested of like, hey, like I live in the city and I think there'd be some interest of like having a meetup and hosting that, please feel free to reach out to me on Slack at Jessica W, I believe, or just find me here. It's just Jessica at temporal.io, and I'd love to talk with you about what we can do. Okay, so finally, there are a lot of community resources that we've been doing, and I'm so excited about it. I just wanted to highlight a few things. So for those of you that have not registered or not signed up for our newsletter, we do a monthly newsletter at the end of each month, highlighting some different things that we're doing across the company and things that we're trying to do to help the community in multiple ways. Some of those things just wanted to highlight here. So we've been doing a lot of work on sagas. This is, I think, depending on like what language community you belong to or what you're thinking about, you may hear a lot about the saga pattern. And that kind of comes and goes of like what's the best way to utilize that. So our developer advocates have been working on some content there, both written and in video. So you can check out our blog and see some recent ones. One of them is a saga pattern made easy. There was a talk just given about it, which we'll upload to YouTube as soon as it's available. I think it's going to be in the next couple of weeks. And then there's a couple of video series that we did on compensating actions with sagas as well. So be sure to check that out if you haven't seen it. It's pretty cool, I think. We also have a blog post if you are using our product in kind of an open source manner and you're trying to figure out what's going on with some latency challenges and using Kubernetes. We also have a blog post recently came out about that. So that's pretty cool. So you can dig in seeing what you can make some improvements on. Or if you're like, I don't want to do that, I want to go to cloud, we've got you covered there too. But a lot of different resources that are there. A new thing that's coming out, I think, in the newsletter today is our dev success team is offering design reviews for your cloud option as well. So if you are a cloud user and you're kind of curious, like, what are my best practices? How can I be doing better? That's an option as well, which I think is pretty cool to have some experts kind of walking you through. Here's how you can best set things up. We have an incubator program we've launched recently. So if you are part of a startup that's in the early stages and you're like, oh, Temporal is really cool, and I love the open source cluster, but I maybe don't have as much resources to dedicate to bringing that online myself, we're offering a new program to help you get onboarded and give you a discount there as well for a cloud product. And then finally, actually from our lovely Tom, we have another one-on-one course out in Java, which is pretty exciting. So now that it's available in Go, TypeScript, and Java, and they're busy working on a lot of other things in anticipation for replay and many others. So those are my my updates. So yeah, so I want to make sure that you can stay connected. So you can put questions in Slack, join a forum, here's a blog, all sorts of fun stuff. And really just want to make sure that we hear from you as much as you hear from us. So it's not just me talking at you, but coming together. So with that, I'm going to start screen sharing and I'm going to pass the retrospective, the Zoom over to Tom, and then we're going to have him walk us through his presentation. Cool. Tom, it's all yours.
All right, Jessica, it's telling me that the host is disabled participant screen sharing. So maybe you need to.
Yeah, let me do that. I thought I enabled you before. So 1 second. So I'll legit ready. See, Zoom is fun. Try now, Tom.
Okay, great. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's taking up the full screen?
Yep,
okay,
it is.
Because I have two monitors. It gets a little confusing sometimes. Great.
Yeah, I love it. Looks great.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Jessica. So some of you might recognize me from our training courses. And as a technical educator, I know that security is an area where people, especially the people who are new to Temporal, if they're just beginning to evaluate it, they have a lot of questions. I am a technical educator here, but I've spent half of my career working as a software engineer, and most of that was in finance, healthcare, and defense. So those are three highly regulated industries, and security was an essential requirement of pretty much every project that I worked on. So I can anticipate what questions people are likely to ask about security because I've asked many of those same questions myself. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to give an overview on the topic. But before I get started, I also want to mention that Peter Sullivan, who's a solution architect here at Temporal, is giving a talk online tomorrow about security in Temporal Cloud. If you're using Temporal Cloud or you're just thinking about using Temporal Cloud, then I'd recommend signing up for that because he's really really knowledgeable. I'm going to begin with a quick recap of Temporal's architecture. A temporal application consists of two main parts. The first is the code that you write, which is going to include the workflow and activity definitions. The second part is provided by the SDK. That includes the worker object that you configure and launch in order to run your code, as well as the client that it uses to communicate with the temporal cluster or temporal cloud. And here that is. If you're self-hosting, you'll have a temporal cluster. Alternatively, if you use our temporal cloud service, we manage those services for you. But in either case, the services that you see here manage the task queues, durable timers, and a lot of other things. One of those other things is managing the event history associated with workflow executions. Those are durably persisted, for example, using a database like MySQL or PostgreSQL or Apache Cassandra. Putting these two parts together, we can now look at the network transport. As the worker executes the code, it uses a temporal client to communicate that, or to communicate the details with a temporal cluster or temporal cloud. So examples of the sort of communication that takes place here includes when the worker polls for tasks, picks up those tasks, and then later it's going to report the outcome of the tasks that it picked up from the queue. That communication takes place through gRPC. The client sends a request and it gets a response back from the temporal cluster or temporal cloud. However, the client that's used by the worker isn't the only client that sends requests to the temporal cluster or temporal cloud. The web UI also contains a client because it fetches a list of workflow executions to display on the main page. When you click on one of those, it retrieves the details of that execution so that you can see exactly what took place. In fact, they keep adding more capabilities to it. Now you can cancel workflow executions, terminate them, or even reset a workflow execution right from the web UI. All of those things use a client. We've also got command line tools like TCTL, that's the older one, and Temporal, that's the newer one. Those use a client to communicate with the temporal cluster or temporal cloud, which allows you to do those things that I mentioned in the web UI and also some others. Finally, you might use a temporal client in an application that you build to interact with a workflow execution. For example, if you're building a web app, when the user clicks a button in that web app, it might trigger a new workflow execution, or it might retrieve the results from one that's already completed. Regardless of whether we're talking about the client inside the worker, the web UI, or the command line tool, or an application that you've built that integrates with Temporal, clients send their requests to the front-end service, or perhaps a load balancer or ingress that is in front of multiple front-end services because it's a scalable system after all. The front-end service routes those requests to the back-end services as needed and then sends the response back to the client. So to recap here, clients communicate with the front-end service. Everything external to the cluster initiates requests through a client, instead of having to open a port for inbound communication from the temporal cluster or temporal cloud. And this design greatly simplifies things from a network management and security perspective, since you only need to pass traffic from clients to a single TCP port on the IP addresses that are used to access the front-end service. Okay, so now that I've touched on perimeter security, which can limit access by bad actors, I want to shift into how Temporal's design protects confidential information. And there's basically two main categories here: protecting data in motion as it's transmitted across the network, and protecting data at rest as it's stored to disk. Temporal supports both of these, and it's typical to use them together. I'm going to begin with data in motion. Maintaining the confidentiality for data in motion is done through TLS, which is the same protocol that you use when you're doing online banking or when you buy something from an e-commerce site. It guards against an attacker who's trying to eavesdrop or tamper with data as it flows between a client and server. Because the client validates the server's identity through a digital certificate, it also helps to ensure that clients are communicating with the actual server and not something attempting to impersonate it. Temporal supports mutual authentication, which is also called MTLS, in which the client also has a certificate. That provides an extra level of security since the server knows that it's talking to a valid client, not an imposter. However, temporal clusters can go one step further when it comes to protecting data in motion. Not only can you use TLS between the client and the front-end service, you can also use TLS for internode communication, that is, between the front-end service and each of the back-end services, as well as among those back-end services. The database that's used for persistence can also be configured to use TLS for network communication, although the database vendor documentation may still refer to this using the name of the original protocol, SSL. So why might it be beneficial to use TLS for internode communication? Well, it's certainly worth considering if your cluster is running on an untrusted network, since an attacker with access to that network could potentially intercept data as it's passed between these services. More broadly, it can provide an extra layer of protection within the perimeter, since attacks sometimes come from the inside. TLS provides security for the communications channel. Data is encrypted before transmission and decrypted when it's received. Therefore, it doesn't protect the data that gets written to disk. If you're relatively new to Temporal, you might wonder why that matters. It all goes back to how Temporal guarantees that your workflow will run to completion even if the application crashes. It achieves that by replaying the history of the execution prior to the crash, which of course requires that the system stores detail about events that take place during workflow execution. So what data is stored in the event history? Well, as you can see here, and this is a screenshot of the web UI, there's the event type, such as workflow task started or activity task completed. There's also an event ID and a timestamp. That's not really confidential information though. But some of these event types also store the input and output used in its execution. For example, the values of input parameters that are passed into a workflow or activity, and the values that are returned, as well as an error if they return that. These could potentially contain confidential information, things like credit card numbers or patient information if you're working in healthcare. That data obviously needs to be protected as it's persisted to disk. Fortunately for us, though, Temporal's design supports this. There's two related concepts in Temporal's design: data converters and codecs. A data converter takes an object that you work with in your code, one which is used as input or output in a workflow or an activity or a signal or a query, and it converts that into a sequence of bytes before sending it across the wire to Temporal Cluster or Temporal Cloud. It also handles the opposite of that, converting the bytes that it receives from the Temporal Cluster or Temporal Cloud back into the objects that you'll use in your code. You can create a custom data converter, though, that wraps the default data converter to do that conversion from object to bytes and passes it through, or rather passes the result through what we call a codec to transform that series of bytes into a different series of bytes. And that's where you can introduce your own encryption and decryption. Codec is short for encoder decoder, and it's pretty straightforward to write one. You just use the API provided by the Temporal SDK to implement an encode function to transform the data before it's sent from the client, in other words, encrypting it, and then implement the decode function to decrypt the data received by the client. Now that I've covered the background, I want to explain the data flow between a worker and the database used for persistence. Finally, First, I'll cover what happens by default when you're using the default data converter and there's no encryption. By default, any object or data structure that will wind up in the event history, which is going to include the input to a workflow execution, it goes through the default data converter. It converts that data into a language neutral format that can be sent across the wire. By default, that data is not encrypted, except during its transport if you're using TLS. But the point is, it's going to be unencrypted when it gets persisted into the event history. Therefore, if that data is confidential, it's vulnerable to someone who has direct access to the database, as well as someone who can use Temporal's APIs or command line tools or the web UI to retrieve that data from the database. Here's an example of what it looks like when you're using a codec. After the data converter turns the object into bytes, it's passed through the codec, which encrypts it. And the client sends that encrypted data over the network to the front-end service, which will eventually get routed to the history service, and ultimately it'll get persisted to disk. When that data is read again, it's still encrypted as it flows through the temporal cluster or cloud, and it's going to remain encrypted until it ultimately passes through the codec on the client side of the connection. So the key point here is that the encryption and decryption both take place on the client side of the connection. The temporal cluster or temporal cloud do not have access to the decrypted data, and they don't have access to the keys that use to encrypt or decrypt it. Let's take that scenario a little further by considering what happens when we use the command line interface to retrieve details of the workflow execution. If the data in the database is encrypted, how can we view it? In this example, I'm using the temporal workflow show command to display details for the specific workflow execution. This will not show me the encrypted data, though, since it was encrypted by the client used by the worker. That's running in a separate process, almost certainly on a different machine, and may not even be accessible from a user that's running the temporal command like I'm illustrating here. The way that you view this information is by using what we call a codec server, which the temporal command uses to decrypt the data as needed. A codec server is just a copy of the codec used to encrypt the data, which you've made accessible through HTTP or HTTPS, typically using an HTTP library provided by whatever language you've written it in. The encrypted data flows from the database through the temporal cluster and over the wire to the client, where it's then passed through the codec server and decrypted so that the client can display it. By the way, I'm using the temporal command in this example, but the same principle applies with the temporal web UI. You'll see the encrypted data by default, but you can configure it to use a codec server so the results will be transparently descripted before being displayed to you. The web UI case is a little more complex, though, because there's cross-site restrictions in the browser security model, and so you have to deal with things like CORS. Our documentation explains this in more detail, though. And that brings me to the end. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention. And before I hand it over, I just want to mention the Temporal Cloud Security webinar that our solution architect, Peter Sullivan, is leading tomorrow. And I'll post a link to its sign-up page in a moment in our chat. And I'll stop there and take any questions you may have.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate your time on that one. So yes, if anybody has any questions, you can either post them in the chat, and I can, Tom and I can read through it, or if you would like to, unmute yourself, that's welcome as well. Yeah, you can ask general questions about the talk, about anything we covered before. No other questions, though. It was a joke. You could ask another question if you want. Thanks, Tom. Are there any other resources, Tom, that you want that people can get some more information on what you just shared, or things that are coming up?
Yeah, so I mentioned the codec and the codec server, and I just want to mention that the samples repositories that we have in our GitHub organization. So if you go to github.com/temporalio, that's obviously where you can find all our repositories. And each language has a samples repository. And I know, for example, Go has an example of the codec server. So if you want to see how one is written and want to use that as the basis of writing one for yourself, it's a good starting point to just begin with that code and then change what it is that you need for your specific use case. So there's one for Go, and I'm pretty sure that I've seen them for other languages as well in the appropriate samples repository. There's also documentation on our website. And this area of security is something where the documentation has expanded quite a bit through the hard work of some of my colleagues from our tech writers. They've done a great job of expanding that area of security. So there's a lot more documentation on this than there was, let's say, this time last year.
Yeah, there's a lot of information. I think if you continue going to like the doc site and what you see on Learn and everything else, the teams have been really busy about trying to create more and more resources, which is pretty cool to see and be part of working that. And of course, we always want feedback from y'all of like, how is that working? Like, is there anything we could be doing better? But in the meantime, just trying to catch up to a lot of things that our engineering team has been working on for a while. And then Chad mentioned in the chat that all the SDK, all the repos for the SDKs have a sample, and all those, like, there's a lot of samples for each repo. So if anybody's not familiar, if you haven't checked it out, there's at least like 10 samples per each one. The SDK team does an excellent job of providing that for y'all out of the box. And then for each one of those, the samples have a sample for a codec server. So you should be able to find that. And if you have any questions on that, you can ask in Slack, or if there's some problems, you can open issue. The team's pretty responsive there. Awesome. Yep. And so we've got those repos there. Thanks, Tom. From all that, I think we've got a little bit of a shortened meetup today. Just like busy schedules with everybody in June with schedules. And as we are adding more things, we're looking forward to hearing from you more. And if it's something you want to give a talk with or kind of come up here, again, feel free to reach out and let me know. Or if it's something you want to see a meetup in your area, please feel free to reach out to me as well. But if there are any questions, then I think we'll end things early unless anybody wants to come up. I'm scanning the crowd of faces and cartoons from Slack pictures. Okay. Well, Brad, any news about Nexus? Yeah, I don't have news. Is there anybody from the product team on that can answer a little more information on Nexus? Looking for Tasha or Ryland. I don't think we have that one. Brad, but we can follow up and come back to you. I'll ask someone from product to reach out. Because I haven't heard anything. I apologize. And I just don't want to speak out of turn. So all right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the June series, and thank you, Tom, for speaking and giving us a great overview. That was awesome. And so with that, until the next time, I'll see all you here in a month. All right. Have a great day. Thanks.